At 8:45 a.m. on January 20th, 1953, President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower remained seated in the rear of a limousine outside the north portico of the White House, refusing to step inside the building where Harry S. Truman awaited him. The temperature hovered at 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Gray clouds blanketed the sky. Within the White House, the sitting president stood at a window, observing the car that refused to advance. Eisenhower had made his intentions unmistakably clear. He would not enter the White House as a guest. He would not share a cup of coffee with the Trumans. He would not adhere to tradition. He would remain in the car and compel Truman to come to him. This was not an issue of scheduling. It was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate slight, delivered at a moment that should have embodied one of the most dignified practices in American democracy: the peaceful transfer of presidential power. The man in that limousine was Dwight Eisenhower, 62 years old, Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, victor of Europe, liberator of millions, the most celebrated military figure in America since Ulysses S. Grant. He had accepted Nazi Germany's surrender. He had commanded armies spanning 2 continents. Kings and prime ministers sought his counsel. The American public had recently elected him president, granting him 55% of the popular vote and a landslide 442 electoral votes. Yet on this January morning, he would not move 20 feet to shake hands with the man who had provided him with nearly everything. Inside the White House stood Harry S. Truman, 68 years old, farmer, haberdasher, county judge, senator, vice president, president. He had made the monumental decision to use atomic weapons. He had confronted Joseph Stalin. He had initiated the Marshall Plan, reconstructing Europe. He had integrated the armed forces. He had dismissed Douglas MacArthur. He had preserved the Western Alliance through the earliest, most perilous years of the Cold War. Just 7 years prior, he had offered to make Dwight Eisenhower president on the Democratic ticket, with Truman himself stepping down to serve as vice president. Eisenhower had declined. He professed no interest in politics, insisting he was a soldier, not a politician. He would serve his nation in uniform, not in elected office. Then, in 1952, Eisenhower ran for president as a Republican, against Truman's party, against Truman's record, against everything Truman had built. Now he sat in a car outside the White House, making the outgoing president approach him as if summoned to the curb. CBS correspondent Eric Sevareid observed the unfolding scene and later summed it up with 3 words. It was astonishing. J.B. West, the White House head usher, witnessed it as well, remarking, "I was glad I wasn't in that car." The bond between these 2 men had not always been fractured. Once they were allies. Once Truman hailed Eisenhower as the greatest military mind of his generation. Once Eisenhower had written Truman letters filled with respect and gratitude. But something shifted. Something irreparably broke. On that cold January morning, the fracture was on full display for the nation. The rupture had not occurred suddenly. It had developed gradually over months and years through a sequence of decisions, betrayals, and political maneuvers that transformed mutual respect into something close to animosity. The initial crack appeared in July 1945 in Germany on the Autobahn outside Potsdam. Truman, newly president after Franklin Roosevelt's death, met with General Eisenhower, hero of D-Day. Together, they drove through the devastated streets of Berlin. Truman looked at the young general beside him and glimpsed the future of American leadership. Then he said something remarkable. "General, there is nothing you may desire that I will not attempt to help you achieve." That included the presidency in 1948. This was no casual remark. Truman meant it. He had been vice president for only 82 days when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. He inherited a war raging on two fronts, with secret atomic research he had never known about, and with Allied leaders he had never met. He felt unprepared. He admired military prowess, and Eisenhower represented everything America sought in a leader at that moment: competence, victory, moral authority earned through tangible achievement. Eisenhower expressed gratitude but refused. He had no political ambitions. He was a soldier. He would remain one. His entire adult life had been devoted to the military. Politics felt alien, a realm where rules were opaque and adversaries harder to discern. Truman respected the decision. In the following years, Truman and Eisenhower collaborated frequently. Their relationship was rooted in mutual necessity. Truman needed competent military leadership as he navigated the early Cold War. Eisenhower required political backing as he transitioned from wartime command to peacetime military administration. Truman appointed Eisenhower Army Chief of Staff in November 1945. Over the years, he awarded Eisenhower the Distinguished Service Medal 3 times, in 1945, 1948, and 1952. When NATO was established in 1949, Truman asked Eisenhower to serve as its first Supreme Commander in 1951. They exchanged cordial letters and met at official events. The relationship was not intimate, but professional, respectful, and effective. Then, in 1947, something extraordinary occurred. Truman repeated the offer, this time in writing, in his private diary. On July 25, 1947, Truman recorded a 3:30 p.m. conversation with Eisenhower, discussing Douglas MacArthur's potential return from Japan to pursue the Republican nomination. MacArthur, another towering military figure, was deeply distrusted by Truman, who feared his autocratic tendencies and his governance of Japan as a proconsul. Truman's proposal was audacious. He suggested that if MacArthur ran as a Republican, Eisenhower should seek the Democratic nomination. Truman offered to step aside and serve as Eisenhower's vice president. He wrote, "I like the Senate anyway. Ike and I could be elected, and my family and I would be content outside this great white jail known as the White House." Truman concluded with a note, "Ike won't quote me, and I won't quote him." This was no fantasy. It was the sitting president offering to demote himself to vice president to place Eisenhower in the Oval Office. It reflected both Truman's lack of confidence in his own political future and his immense trust in Eisenhower's leadership and character. Eisenhower declined again. At the time, he was president of Columbia University, having left active military command. He preferred education or a potential return to the military over politics. Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal approached him later that year, delivering Truman's offer a final time. Eisenhower again refused. He told Royal the same thing he had told Truman. He was uninterested in becoming president. The position held no appeal. He was content with his life. In February 1948, Truman awarded Eisenhower his 4th Distinguished Service Medal at a White House ceremony. They posed for photographs. The images betrayed no hint of the animosity to come. Eisenhower wore his dress uniform with medals and ribbons. Truman appeared proud to stand beside him. Newspapers captioned the images as two close colleagues working together to secure America's future. That same year, Truman faced the steepest political challenge of his presidency. Approval ratings had collapsed. The Democratic Party was fracturing. Henry Wallace ran as a progressive, splitting the left. Strom Thurmond ran as a Dixiecrat, dividing the South. Republicans controlled both houses. Predictions foresaw a landslide victory for Republican nominee Thomas Dewey. Yet Truman defied expectations, overcame terrible polls, and, a divided party, winning the 1948 election. One of the greatest upsets in American political history, achieved without Eisenhower. But Eisenhower's repeated refusals planted questions in Truman's mind. If Eisenhower truly had no political ambitions, why did people persist in asking him to run? And if he was uninterested, why did he refuse in ways that left the door ajar? The answer arrived in 1952, when Eisenhower announced his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination. The news startled many, but Truman was most shocked. For 5 years, Eisenhower had claimed no political interest, turning down Democratic offers to become president effortlessly. Now, he entered politics as a Republican, opposing Truman's party. Truman felt personally betrayed. He had twice offered Eisenhower the presidency, willing to become vice president himself. Eisenhower had declined. Now he sought the office, but not from Truman or the Democrats. Yet politics alone did not fracture their bond. Differences in policy could be managed. The decisive rupture occurred during the campaign over George Catlett Marshall. Born in Pennsylvania in 1880, Marshall graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901. He served in the Philippines, in France during World War I, and in China between wars. A master of organization and logistics, he built armies, coordinated global operations, and selected leaders who could perform under impossible pressure. During World War II, as Army Chief of Staff from 1939 to 1945, Marshall transformed the U.S. Army from fewer than 200,000 men to over 8 million. He directed battle plans, allocated resources, and built the system that made Eisenhower's career possible. In 1941, Eisenhower, then a relatively unknown lieutenant colonel, caught Marshall's attention. Promoted rapidly over hundreds of senior officers, Eisenhower commanded Allied forces in North Africa by 1942 and was recommended by Marshall to lead Operation Overlord in 1943. Marshall could have resented the glory Eisenhower received, but he never did. Churchill called him the organizer of victory. Historians credit him with constructing the military machine that won World War II. Afterward, Marshall sought retirement at 65, but Truman called him to serve as Secretary of State from 1947 to 1949. He shaped the Marshall Plan, providing over $13 billion to rebuild Europe. Awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, Marshall returned to retirement, only to serve as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War from September 1950 to September 1951. Strengthening the military and NATO structures. In 1951, Senator Joseph McCarthy attacked Marshall during the height of anti-communist hysteria. He accused Marshall of communist sympathies and even a vast conspiracy, claims that were absurd and false. Senator William Jenner intensified the attacks, calling Marshall a traitor's frontman and implicating Truman and Secretary of State Acheson. Truman was enraged. He called Marshall the greatest living American and expected Eisenhower, indebted to Marshall, to defend him. Yet, during Eisenhower's October 1952 campaign stop in Milwaukee, he omitted a prepared statement defending Marshall to avoid offending McCarthy and Wisconsin Republicans. The photograph of Eisenhower shaking hands with McCarthy went nationwide. The New York Times ran it front page. Columnists condemned the decision. Truman publicly labeled Eisenhower a coward, using Marshall's defense to question Eisenhower's character, judgment, and presidential readiness. The tension continued through the election, the transition, and the inauguration. Eisenhower refused traditional courtesies, including wearing a non-traditional hat and remaining in the car while Truman approached him. Years later, in 1963, Both attended President Kennedy's funeral, sharing conversation for the first time in a decade. Over time, their animosity softened. They reunited briefly at Blair House and in 1966 in Kansas City. Eisenhower died March 28, 1969, at 78, leaving a legacy of infrastructure, foreign policy, and Cold War leadership. Truman passed December 26, 1972, at 88, returning to Missouri to continue his life in public service. The events of January 20, 1953, became a cautionary tale. Personal grievances can overshadow duty. For a decade, two towering figures remained apart. Only time and circumstance restored a measure of reconciliation, though the memory of that cold January morning endured.